Hey guys, welcome to today's lesson. We're going to take a look at adjusting color, not just for making it pleasing to the eye, but making it accurate. We're looking at making colors match in the real world, what they show on your monitor, what they're going to print, how they're going to reproduce, all that good stuff. So I have an image here with a few distinct colors in it. We have some recognizable branding on this little aircraft. We have ASU's maroon and gold. We've got white, a neutral tone. We've got this other company, ATP, ASU's Flight School, and their personal brand of red, and I don't know if that's a branded blue up there that we could look up, but possibly we have a really saturated sky and some other stuff going on. So this is a good image to play around with and do some things with and show you. But there's that. So I'm going to show you kind of the way I learned to adjust color. There are other ways, some newer ways, and I'm not that old, but I guess this is the old way of doing it that I'm going to show you tonight. If we were shooting a raw image and we were in control of the photography from scratch, then we would probably use something like a color checker chart, which you can see one of those right here in another photo. And we can white balance based on that. We just use our little eyedropper tool, click on one of these neutral patches, and if my computer will unfreeze, I'm in Lightroom right now, by the way. Click on the little gray neutral patch, and all of a sudden, ta-da, we're all neutral, colors are great, all that good stuff. We can build profiles. It gets a lot more complex, but that's one way to do it. A lot of times you don't have that luxury, though. You're going with a photo that's provided to you, especially if you're going to be doing any retouching for someone else. You're not necessarily the photographer who's retouching his own photos. You're going to be retouching that which is provided to you. So here's one way to do that. Anyhow, let's take a look. So, first things you want to do is to neutralize the color. Whether you're going to be going crazy and adjusting or adding some overall color tone or look or cross process or bleach bypass or some other look that you want to apply, that's great and it's all well and good, but you want to have neutral color first. That's your starting point. You want to have all your images neutralized. And what neutralize means is simply that gray is gray. Gray is not a little bit green or a little bit red or a little bit maroon. Gray is just pure gray. All your color values are going to be even when you're looking at your channel. So let's take a look at how that works. First off, this is a DNG image, a raw file that I've opened in Photoshop, and I'm going to start looking at some things on there. So in my panels here on the right, I've got the info panel, and I'm going to undock that just because this is going to be really helpful to have up in front of us. We're going to be using this a lot. You'll notice that on the info panel you can you can make adjustments here. I have it right now to display the CMYK values. You can change that. Just click on the little eyedropper icon to have it do RGB or whatever. I have it on CMYK. We're just pretending that this is going to be printed on a CMYK press, and that's what I'm adjusting for now. So the first thing that I would want to do in this process, my workflow, is to neutralize that. And the way I'll do that is to use the eyedropper tool. Now the eyedropper, if you'll notice, I click on a color, it's going to load that color in my color palette. But that's not what we're going to use it for. There's a modifier key. Hold down Shift. You'll notice that now I have a little crosshair there on my cursor. And I can shift and click out here on these areas. Let's say out here on the white of the plane. And now I have a little target, a crosshair target right in that area. Let me zoom in for you. Try and get a little closer, and you can see I put down a little target right there. And if I look on my info panel, now I have under number 1, I've got these RGB values for that white, exactly in that point. And let me switch those to CMYK as well. Alright, so there's my CMYK values. Let's leave it RGB. Be easier to look through just 3 numbers instead of 4. Alright, so there's white. Now I can neutralize kind of my mid-tones there, because that's not pure white. That's not like a highlight. That's just, neutral white. We want to find some black as well. So let's zoom in and take a look and say here's some black. And let's switch back to my eyedropper tool, shift click, and there we have a black point as well. So I'm doing pretty good with this image actually to start with. My red and green channels are already perfectly level. My blue channel is a little low. That means there's not as much blue in those white areas as there should be to make it completely neutral. In my blacks, it's pretty neutral already. Let's look a little closer and find maybe another neutral area just to have a wider range. So let's see, maybe under here in the shadow. So this is white as well. Let's just put a little color picker down there. Looks pretty dark, but it's actually white. It's just in the shade. But that's not neutral either. Now this gets a little tricky, just as a note too, because I'm getting a lot of digital noise, that graininess in that area, and so it might be picking up some color from the grain, you know, that graininess, rather than just a simple color cast in the entire image. But we'll just leave it for now and go with that. So that's one way of doing it, just eyeballing what you think the neutral color should be and going from there. But I'm going to undo all that. Let me back those points out. Okay, so I don't have my points in anymore. The reason I backed that out is because I want to show you a different way to pick your white and your black points. So if you notice down at the bottom of your layers panel or under the adjustments, there is an option for threshold. Let's see which one that is. Right there, threshold. I click on that, and what it does is it gives me an adjustment layer, and in the properties panel for that adjustment I can drag the slider right and left. And what that does is it's going to allow me to see what the brightest whites and darkest darks are in this image. So pure black is when it's all the way to the left. So any of these little spots that you see out here on my screen, those are pure black. And then as I slide this over to the right, if I go all the way to the right of my histogram here, there's nothing there. That means that I have, I'm not using all of the dynamic range that's available to me. So there's a couple things. First, before I go further with that threshold, I'm going to add another adjustment layer, because just eyeballing this I can see it's maybe a little bit dark. So let's go ahead and put on a levels adjustment. And there's my histogram again. Let's just slide this over a bit. Right about there. Let's just go with that for now, and let's turn back on the threshold and start sliding it around. And you can see now I have a little bit more to work with there on my brights. So I can come in here and let's just say right there, first point that starts coming in is going to be right about there, let's say. So I'm going to shift click out in this white area, and that will be my neutral brights. Let's go the other direction all the way over here, and where does black first start coming in? Down on the tire. See the tire down here? So we'll click out in that spot. And then we can just turn that threshold layer off. We can even just throw it away. And now I have a white and a black point. And you can see that pretty well here from my numbers. Numerically, it's very much more white and black than it was before. Alright, so good to go. Good to start making our adjustments, right? Yes, in a way. So if we're working on RGB workflow, we just go from here. If we're working CMYK, we might want to do a little more work. So let's look at RGB first, and we'll come back to CMYK. I'm going to throw in a couple of more points just because we have other colors here to look at. So we have ASU's gold and ASU's maroon. Alright, so there we go. So those are out as well, just for kicks, so we know what they are. Now, first things first, we want to make our white white, and we want to make our black black. Now, considering that our RGB values for black are numbered 2 point up here on the info panel, they are 1, 1, and 0. That's pretty much as close to black as you can get. I'm not even going to mess with that. In our white, we have 207, 208 for red and green. Our blue is a little bit low at 197. So let me show you how we would go about adjusting that. We could do it with levels. I'm not going to fiddle around with levels though. I'm going to just go straight into curves. It's a little bit more fine-tuned control. Let's pop this out. I like to have it a little bit bigger so I can see what I'm working with. Alright, so here we are. Curves, and as you know from before in our previous lessons, you can adjust individual channels. Now we have a little bit low on blue there, so we're going to crank the blue up. And I always forget which side of this adjusts the brights and which is the dark, so I have to start by playing around, but it looks like I got it first try. So if I grab this top corner of my curves, without actually adding a curve to this, I'm just going to clip the highlights in a little bit. And what that does is it adds more blue into the highlights. So now I'm at 208 for blue, 208 for green, and 207 for red. Just for kicks, let's go to red and we'll adjust it at 1.208. There we go. Alright, so now let's take a look. 208, 208, 208 in our whites. And I'm going to turn that on and off and look at my image, and you can see that there really was like a orangish, gross kind of color cast on that white paint job on that plane, right? I don't know if it's showing up a terrible lot in your video there on this streaming video. Probably not, but take my word for it. It is a big difference. Alright, so we'll just go with that. There's our white point. Now let's move on to our black point. So black point 1, 1, 1. This image that I started with was a little too easy. We didn't even have to make a single adjustment there. It's already black. 1 point for each of those. So I'm not going to mess with it one bit. Right? So now we have our color points, our yellow and our maroon, our ASU colors. So let's say what we want those to be. Looking at this for number 3, we have 167, 152, and 30. I'm going to just tab over here. I've opened up the ASU COM guide to see, and so in gold, their RGB values are 255, 179, and 16. 259, 170, 255, 179, and 16. I'll forget those over and over, I'm sure. Now, we can't really make our airplanes gold quite as bright and saturated as the actual ASU branding guideline, because it's a paint job in a photograph. There's tone to it. There's other light being reflected off it. There's a blue sky giving it a color cast. So it's not going to be the exact same, but ballpark, we can eyeball it and we can look and we can get it close. If you're working for a client who is has very particular tastes, you know, like a brand that has a certain color that they've invested in, you might need to adjust it a little bit more to get it precise. And if you were going to do that, then the way to adjust that would be just like we did before. We could open up our curves, go back into that curves panel, and start adjusting these individual channels again. So because that yellow is not all the way up to 255, or I'm sorry, the red channel is not 255, then we would need to make some tweaks here. So we're going to bring up, you know, I'm just guessing here, we're going to bring up that quite a bit to get that all the way up to 255, and it's going to make our whole image look really weird. But let's just see what happens if we bring up our green was let's see, 179. So that's pretty close to begin with. Let's just get that up to 179, and blue was 16. So you can see at that one particular point in that image, it is exactly what we want it to be as far as the actual ASU gold color. Now the nice thing with that is I would have done this, if I were intending to actually do this process, I would have done it with a separate curves layer, is that I can put a mask on it now. Or I'm sorry, I already have a mask on. I can just adjust the mask on that and start painting in everything that I don't want shown, like this stuff over here. So I get rid of all that weird yellow everywhere else that I don't want it to be. You know, and obviously you're going to use a little bit more refined masking techniques. But the general idea is that I can have that curves adjustment applied to just that one particular area so that I get the exact color that I want. And then you can, you know, rinse and repeat and do that same process with your maroon. And I can really brighten up and saturate that maroon to match the color values, you know, the 153, 0, 51 RGB values for ASU's maroon. So I can really tweak this photo to make it a lot closer. Now, you want this to be kind of realistic, so probably turn down the opacity a little bit of the curves adjustment, but you know, combining these steps will allow you to really reproduce very, very accurate color and very precise color, which is important. So a combination of using your curves adjustment, your levels adjustment, and layer mask is very critical. Painting in and masking objects out so that the color is only being tweaked in certain areas. That's really important. But the most important thing that I want you guys to kind of take away from this video is the ability to pin specific points on your info palette. And again, that's with the eyedropper tool. It's I on the keyboard, and then shift click on a point, on a location, to pin that. So you have those values. Then when you go into your levels or your curves adjustment, as you make changes, you can see what those changes are doing to those points. So if I go this far over on my highlight adjustment on the levels, you can see it's clipping. My RGB values on my white are all 255. And that's not a good thing, because that means that I've completely blown out my whites. There's absolutely no tonality there. There's no detail. It's just a blotch of white blank paper where no ink is going to go, or if it's digital, where just pure white pixels are going to show through, and it's going to look really bad. Anyway, let me undo a couple steps here. Let's back up. Okay, so let's say right about there. Don't know where my adjustment is at this point, but so that's your RGB workflow. Pretty simple. There's a lot more you could do, and I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to go through the whole process here. Just I want to show you the tricks. But I've adjusted my white and my black for RGB. Now let's say that this is a CMYK workflow that we're going to use. So I'm going to change my points to CMYK. So I have this. Now a couple of things to consider. I'm not sure if you guys have gotten into any color theory or the print classes, or some of you probably won't even get into that with your web majors, but just in case it ever comes up and you have to work on a CMYK file or a file destined for a CMYK output, you kind of need to be familiar with this a little bit. What you want to do is to consider the way that ink is going to act or behave on paper. And the way that works is that paper is white. So anything that's white is going to have no ink on it, right? So the white body of this airplane, if it's going to be white, then there's going to be no ink there. And I'm kind of redundant, I know, but I want to make the point that paper is white. Just make sure that you understand that. So anything that's got no ink is going to be just white paper showing through. Now, with a photograph, you don't want any paper showing through. You may want ink to be very, very thin in certain areas, and that's how you would reproduce white. It's just having a thin layer of ink, or very, sparsely spaced dots of ink, but not pure white paper. That's going to be, again, that's your clipping, and it's going to look really, really bad. You need to have a certain value of ink, or a certain density of ink covering the entire paper area. That way it doesn't go from, a light shade of gray right over here. Let's just look at area of transition. So right here, we've got kind of a shadow in this area, and then as the plane, or the surface of the plane changes, we have a little bit wider area here. If we do this wrong, we're going to have completely white plain paper right there with no ink next to a slightly grayer area, and it's going to look really jarring and really, really bad. So the way that we get around that is, on our points, we don't ever go all the way to 0 with our ink. That's about it. That's what you have to do. What you would do instead is you're going to drop your points down a little bit. So let's look at a curves adjustment again. Here we go, curves. And now under channels, actually because we're on RGB image, so I need to convert this. So I'm going to convert this to CMYK, but that's not the way we do it. We go to convert to profile. We always want to have a profile attached. So let's just put this on swap. Hit OK. And it flattens your image. Just be aware of that. If you're going to convert your image, it's going to flatten it. So usually you want to convert at the very, very end of your process or at the very beginning. I'm just doing it now simply to show you the curves adjustment with the CMYK channels. So let's go into cyan. Let's take a look at our point. We have, for point 1, that's our white, 13, 10, and 17. Now inks behave a little bit different. With RGB values, you can just level them out. Inks are a little bit different. Cyan does not reflect as much light as some of the other colors. It does not produce as much color output on paper. It's not as saturated as dark as some of the other colors, magenta and yellow. So your cyan percentage value needs to be a little bit higher than the others in order for it to actually be neutral. So let's look at our yellow, and let's just tone yellow down a tad. And you can see as I'm doing this, it's the wrong side now because I'm not adjusting my highlight point. I want to go from this end. Let's make that 10. right there. Oh, close enough. Let's make it 9. So 9, 10, and 13. So that's a little bit closer to actual white in that area. If we were looking at RGB, let's just see what it translates in RGB. 218, 218, 220. So pretty darn close right there. Alright, and then in our black, some of you probably know about a thing in printing called rich black. And rich black is where you don't use simply black ink, you use a combination of black ink, cyan, magenta, and yellow ink to make it a really deep, rich, dark black. Otherwise it looks like kind of a muddy grayish in a photo. And so to achieve that, again, we're going to come into our curves. Let's look at our point on our black point, and we have 75, 68, 64, and 90. 90 is about where we want to be with the black. We're going to go and let's just turn our cyan. Actually, we're right where we want to be. We want our cyan again to be a little bit higher than the others, 75. Our magenta might be a little high. So let's tone our magenta down. Let's go right there. And we'll say that's good for our black. Now, I'm happy with this image, but it's going to be kind of up to your printer. So if you're going into this kind of stuff, this fine-tuned color management, you're going to want to have some communication with your printer, talk to them, and find out what their process is, what ink values they want to use, because it can vary. Every device is different, and so if they're using a certain device, you know, like an offset 4-color press, it's going to be different than if they're using a 7-color HP Indigo press. So it just varies a lot, and you'll want to check in with them and communicate, and that's kind of the process that you'll follow. But again, just want to emphasize the main point of this video is for you to understand that you can add these points, these monitoring points of what your color values are in each channel, and you can read those, and you can change your curves or your levels or your hue or saturation or any of your adjustments, and you can see what effect that's having on your actual colors in the image. So I think that's pretty cool. One of the most helpful things when you're editing color in a photo. I like it a lot. So there you go. We might have a little bit of this in our assignments, so take note of this stuff, but that's all for now.